Welcome to the True Crime Studio. Millionaire disguised as Maid, meet Fiancé's family, but what they did changes everything. In this heartwarming and entertaining video, we dive into the intriguing tale of a millionaire who takes on the role of a maid to meet her fiancé's family. This unique and captivating story unfolds as our protagonist, a successful businesswoman, decides to hide her true identity to understand her future in-laws better. With a dash of humor and a sprinkle of romance, this video offers an engaging experience for viewers of all ages.
Grace Taylor gazed out of the airplane window, watching the vast Arizona desert stretch below her like an endless painting. Despite the clear blue sky, her mind was clouded. For weeks, she had been battling doubts. But now there was no turning back. At 32, she was a successful CEO, leading one of the most innovative tech companies in the market, Innovatech Solutions. Yet behind her strong and confident exterior, she still bore the marks of a humble upbringing. Balancing the woman she had become with the girl she once was remained a constant struggle. Her relationship with Oliver Walker, a brilliant and dedicated lawyer, had brought unexpected happiness into her life, but also reignited insecurities she preferred to bury. No matter how lovingly he treated her, Grace couldn't shake the question that echoed in her mind. What did Oliver really know about her? About the hardships she had faced, the times when her family barely had food on the table. And even worse, what would his wealthy, traditional family think of her? That was what had driven her to embark on this bold, perhaps utterly insane plan. It wouldn't be the powerful Grace Taylor meeting the Walkers. She would go as a simple housekeeper, blending into the family's daily life to test their true values and intentions. It was a calculated risk, but a necessary one to determine if she could build a future with Oliver. Upon landing at the small local airport, Grace swapped her pristine business suit for plain, worn clothes. In the airport restroom, she tied her hair into a messy bun and wiped away the subtle makeup that usually enhanced her natural elegance. Staring at her reflection in the mirror, she barely recognized the powerful woman who led meetings and made million-dollar decisions. Now she looked like just another ordinary person, invisible to the crowd. The Walker mansion was even more impressive than Grace had imagined. A grand structure, surrounded by meticulously trimmed gardens and architectural details that exuded wealth and tradition. As soon as she rang the doorbell, the door was opened by Helen Walker, the family matriarch. Her eyes scanned Grace from head to toe, as if she were an object to be appraised. "You must be the new hire," Helen said, not even waiting for confirmation. Her voice carried a coldness that matched the luxurious yet impersonal atmosphere of the house. Grace hesitated for a moment, but quickly nodded and replied, keeping her nerves in check. "Yes, that's me." Helen didn't smile. She simply stepped aside and gestured for her to come in. The interior of the house was as grand as its exterior, with opulent furniture and art pieces strategically placed. Still, there was a chill in the air, as if all the sophistication failed to make the space feel welcoming. "We have a few rules here," Helen began as she led Grace through the house. "We don't tolerate tardiness. Common areas must always be spotless. And please limit your interactions with family members. Your place is behind the scenes, ensuring everything runs smoothly." With every word, Grace felt the subtle hostility hidden in Helen's orders. She kept her head down, murmuring acknowledgments as she absorbed it all. This was the matriarch's true nature, and Grace was ready to face the challenge. That was when Emily appeared. Young, with brown hair tied in a ponytail, she carried a heavy tray of dishes with an effortless grace. Her smile was warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to Helen's tone. "You must be the new helper. Welcome," Emily said, placing the tray on the table. Her voice was sweet, almost disarmingly so. Grace smiled back, feeling a wave of relief. "Thank you. I think I'll need some help finding my way around." "Of course. I can show you where everything is. It's a bit confusing at first, but you'll get the hang of it quickly." Emily glanced at Helen briefly, ensuring the matriarch had left the room before whispering, "Don't worry, she's like that with everyone." Emily guided Grace through the house, pointing out the areas she'd be responsible for and where to find cleaning supplies. During the tour, Grace noticed Emily was much more than just an employee. There was something in her eyes, a spark of determination, perhaps even a hint of rebellion against a life that seemed to confine her. Emily mentioned her dream of studying business management, though she admitted it was hard to find the time and money to pursue it. In the days that followed, Grace grew accustomed to the grueling routine of the household. Helen found fault in everything she did, from the arrangement of the silverware to the way she mopped the floors. Richard, the patriarch, was more reserved but no less condescending. Always with a book in hand, he observed the staff with an air of intellectual superiority that grated on Grace. On the other hand, Emily became a constant source of support and inspiration. During their brief moments of rest, the two would talk about their lives. Grace, of course, had to fabricate details to keep her true identity hidden, but she listened intently to Emily's stories. The young woman dreamed of being respected for her intelligence, not just her ability to clean a house. One evening, while tidying Richard's office, Grace noticed a shelf lined with books on corporate ethics and social responsibility. The irony wasn't lost on her. This man, who preached values in public, couldn't apply the same respect within his own household. That night, Grace lay on the narrow, uncomfortable bed in her small room, feeling the weight of the day on her shoulders. Her disguise was working, but the mission was proving more challenging than she had anticipated. Every interaction with Helen or Richard was a stark reminder of how deceiving appearances could be. Yet when she thought of Emily and the glimmer of hope the young woman carried, Grace felt her resolve strengthen. She was ready to face whatever came her way, even knowing there was still a long road ahead. The first pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, and Grace knew that sooner or later she would have to confront the truth she feared most. What did Oliver Walker truly represent in the midst of it all? The first ray of sunlight slipped through the curtains of the small room Grace now called her own. The thin mattress didn't let her forget the discomfort, but to her it was part of the role she was playing. Even so, the emotional burden of her disguise far outweighed any physical exhaustion. Each day in the Walker household was a mix of revelations, challenges, and a growing awareness of how social status dictated interactions in that world. In the kitchen, the familiar sounds of clinking pots and boiling water already filled the air. Emily was there, preparing the family's breakfast as she did every morning, with a near-mechanical dedication. Grace joined her silently. Emily, ever kind, smiled. "Did you sleep well?" Emily asked, her voice full of sympathy. Grace hesitated but responded with a faint smile. "Well enough. You seem like you're used to all of this." Emily let out a brief, bitter laugh. "You get used to it, it's not easy, but what else can we do?" Grace wanted to say something encouraging, but before she could, Helen entered the kitchen. Her presence always made the air feel heavier. Her eyes scanned the room and, as usual, she found something to criticize. "Emily, this table isn't ready yet. And you," she said, addressing Grace for the first time that day, "I want you to clean the main hall as soon as you're done here. We have guests coming this afternoon, and I don't want them to see a single speck of dust. Understood?" Grace nodded, keeping her head down. Inside, her patience was starting to wear thin. Every interaction with Helen was a harsh reminder of what people like Emily had to endure daily. Still, she knew her mission depended on staying in character. The main hall was a masterpiece in itself, with expensive furniture, imported rugs, and chandeliers that looked like they were made of pure crystal. Grace was on her knees, scrubbing the floor, when she heard Richard's firm footsteps behind her. She sensed his presence before she even heard his voice. "The floor should shine like a mirror," he said in a tone that was meant to sound polite, but carried an air of superiority. Grace mumbled something in agreement without looking up, but couldn't help feeling a surge of anger. The irony of hearing this from a man who publicly preached values like equality and empathy was almost unbearable. Silently, she continued her work, determined to observe more than she spoke. When she finished, she found Emily in the hallway struggling under the weight of a heavy stack of towels. Emily looked exhausted, but still managed to smile for Grace. "Helen's in a good mood today. She's only complained to me 3 times so far," Emily said, attempting humor that couldn't quite mask her frustration. "How do you deal with this every day?" Grace asked, genuinely curious. Emily shrugged, pausing to adjust the towels. "You adapt. My mum used to say some battles aren't worth fighting, especially when you know you can't win." Grace felt a lump in her throat. She wanted to tell Emily that every battle is worth fighting, but she knew it would be hypocritical. Emily didn't have the luxury of choosing her battles like Grace did. All she could do was tuck that thought away and consider how she might help Emily in the future. The afternoon brought Helen's guests, a wealthy couple clearly from the same social circle. The now spotless living room became a stage for fake laughter and shallow conversations about investments and charity dinners. Grace, serving tea and cookies, watched everything in silence. It was when Helen made a comment that nearly caused Grace to spill the teapot. Housekeepers these days are so hard to find. They just don't have the same standards we grew up with. You understand, don't you? The guest laughed in agreement. Oh, absolutely. It always feels like we have to supervise everything. Otherwise, the house would fall apart. Grace felt her blood boil. Even with her head down, she could feel their eyes on her and Emily, as if they were invisible, mere objects fulfilling a function. Despite her anger, she held back. Her role was to observe, and she knew speaking up in that moment would jeopardize everything. That evening, while cleaning the kitchen with Emily, the young woman finally broke the silence. "You heard what they said, didn't you?" Emily asked, not looking at her. Grace nodded, waiting for Emily to continue. "They always talk like we're not here, like we don't have ears or feelings." There was a long pause before Emily murmured, "I want so badly to get out of here. But how?" Grace stopped cleaning and looked at Emily. She desperately wanted to tell her there was a way, that she could help, but she knew it was too soon. For now, all she could do was promise herself that she would do something. "Never lose hope," Grace said, her voice quiet but firm. "Things can change." Emily didn't respond, but her eyes seemed to say she wanted to believe those words. As Grace prepared for bed that night, the weight of the day felt heavier than ever. The walkers' masks were starting to slip, revealing the hypocrisy hidden beneath layers of sophistication. But what haunted her the most was the question she couldn't ignore. Where did Oliver fit into this world? She knew he would return soon. And when he did, her mission would become even more challenging. The days dragged on as a test of patience for Grace. Life at the Walker household was exhausting, not just physically but emotionally. Every interaction with Helen was a delicate dance of obeying orders and avoiding confrontation. Richard, though more distant, exuded the same air of superiority that made the environment feel like a constant competition to prove who was more untouchable. Emily, however, was the bright spot in the chaos. Grace clung to their conversations, learning more about the young woman's dreams and frustrations. Emily wanted to study, to be more than a housekeeper. She wanted freedom. And while Grace kept her true identity hidden, she found in Emily's dreams a reflection of her own journey. It was on a warm morning that everything changed. Oliver came home. Grace was in the kitchen, washing dishes alongside Emily, when she heard the distinct sound of the front door opening. Voices echoed through the mansion, warm tones, filled with laughter and familiarity. Oliver had a way of filling a room with energy, and even without seeing him, Grace felt her heart race. "Looks like the prince is back," Emily said with a soft laugh, drying her hands on her apron. "Helen's always so much more tolerable when he's around." Grace smiled, trying to mask the nervousness creeping over her. She knew it was only a matter of time before she had to face him. The question was how. A few minutes later, as Emily wiped down the counter, the kitchen door opened. Oliver stepped in, laughing at something Richard had said. He looked different from the last time Grace had seen him, more relaxed but with the same magnetic presence that had drawn her to him in the first place. "Oh, you must be the new housekeeper," Oliver said, stopping briefly to look at Grace. His tone was friendly but casual, as if fulfilling a polite obligation. Grace froze, turning slowly to face him. She kept her posture humble, her gaze lowered, and replied, "Yes, sir." For a brief moment Oliver's eyes narrowed, as though something about her seemed familiar. But he shook his head, distracted, and continued. "Well, welcome. I hope my mother hasn't been giving you too much trouble." Grace almost laughed, but managed to keep a straight face. "No, sir. Everything's fine." Oliver smiled warmly before leaving. Grace remained still, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading down the hall. He hadn't recognized her. Not yet. Emily, sensing the tension, glanced at Grace curiously. "Are you okay? You seem off." "I'm fine," Grace replied quickly, returning to her work. But inside, her mind was racing. Oliver was here, and now everything would get more complicated. In the days that followed, Oliver began to notice Grace more often. He saw her in the hallways, the gardens, even the living room, always busy, always in her role as a housekeeper. There was something about her that intrigued him, but he couldn't quite place it. Helen, on the other hand, seemed more suspicious than ever. One day, as Grace served tea in the study, Helen pulled her aside. "You walk around here like you're spying on the house," she said, her eyes locked on Grace's. "I hope you understand your place." Grace kept her head down, responding simply, "Yes, ma'am." But inside, her resolve only grew. Helen didn't know it, but her behavior only strengthened Grace's purpose. That afternoon, Grace was in the garden watering the plants when Oliver approached her again. This time he seemed less distracted, more focused. "Can I help with that?" he asked, taking the watering can from her hands before she could respond. "There's no need, sir. I can manage." "Please, call me Oliver. That sir stuff makes me feel old." Grace looked at him, surprised. Oliver was closer now, and she noticed he was studying her as if trying to figure something out. Her heart started to beat faster, but she kept her expression neutral. "All right, Oliver," she said reluctantly. He smiled, but there was something more in his eyes, a spark of recognition. "Have we met before?" he asked, tilting his head. Grace froze for a moment, but quickly shook her head. "No, sir. I mean, Oliver." Oliver narrowed his eyes, but didn't press further. He simply gave a brief smile before handing the watering can back and walking away. As soon as he disappeared through the gate, Grace let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. He was suspicious. It wouldn't be long before the pieces began to fall into place. Meanwhile, Emily was also feeling the pressure. Helen, irritated over something trivial, had accused her of negligence during breakfast. Though Emily had done her job perfectly, Helen made a point of reprimanding her in front of the guests. Later, in the small room they shared, Grace found Emily crying silently. She sat beside her, saying nothing at first. "It shouldn't be like this," Emily said, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "I just want a little respect." Grace placed a hand on her shoulder. "You deserve more than respect, Emily. You deserve a chance to show what you're capable of." Emily gave a sad smile but didn't respond. To her, that still felt like a distant dream. Grace knew she needed to act soon. Her mission wasn't just about testing the walkers anymore. It was about ensuring Emily had a chance to break free from this cycle. And deep down, she knew Oliver would be the key to changing everything. But he'd have to see the truth before it was too late. The following days at the Walker mansion brought a mix of tension and revelations for Grace. Oliver's presence had shifted the household dynamic. He was charismatic and kind to everyone, but his kindness felt uninformed, more a reflection of good manners than an understanding of what was happening around him. For Grace, maintaining her disguise was becoming increasingly difficult. Oliver continued to watch her closely, as though trying to figure out something that didn't quite add up. Helen, meanwhile, seemed determined to create an even more hostile environment, ramping up her demands and criticisms, especially toward Emily, who was beginning to show signs of wear. One afternoon, while cleaning Richard's study, Grace stumbled upon a small pile of old papers in a drawer he had left open. They were employee records, terminations, warnings, and even some complaints about working conditions. One name caught her attention: Camilla Hayes, Emily's mother. The record showed that Camilla had worked at the mansion for nearly a decade before being abruptly fired. Poor performance and disrespectful behavior, the termination reason read. Grace frowned. She knew Emily well enough to believe that someone as dedicated as her daughter wouldn't have been any different. Something about that explanation didn't sit right. Before she could investigate further, she heard footsteps and quickly put the papers back. Richard entered the study, barely glancing at her before sitting at his desk. He seemed oblivious to her presence, immersing himself in one of his books on corporate ethics, an irony Grace still couldn't get over. But the discovery about Camilla now weighed heavily on her mind, and she knew she needed to ask Emily about it. That evening, Grace found Emily in the kitchen, scrubbing one of the counters harder than necessary. It was clear something was bothering her. "Emily, is everything okay?" Grace asked, sitting at the table to avoid seeming intrusive. Emily sighed, dropping the cloth and leaning against the counter. "My mum, she worked here for years, you know," she began, almost unprompted, but she was fired suddenly. "She never told me the details, but I know it was because of Helen. My mum said something she didn't like." Grace's heart sank. "And how did that affect you?" Emily let out a bitter laugh. "How do you think? My mum spent months unable to find another job. We got behind on rent, almost lost the house. That's why I started working so young, to help my family." Grace placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. "You shouldn't have to carry that burden alone. Your mother was wronged." Emily shrugged. "Maybe. But what can we do? These people have all the power. We're just invisible to them." Grace felt anger rise within her. Emily wasn't invisible to her, and she knew that sooner or later the Walkers would have to face reality. The next morning during breakfast, Grace witnessed yet another example of Helen's hypocrisy. While serving tea to the guests, she overheard Helen boasting about her charitable initiatives with a false smile. "It's so important to give back, you know, to show the world that we truly care," Helen said, adjusting the diamond rings on her fingers. Grace kept her expression neutral, but noticed the discomfort in Oliver's gaze. He sat beside his mother, but he seemed out of place, as though he didn't want to be part of the conversation. It was the first time Grace saw a flicker of dissatisfaction in him, and it gave her hope. Later, while cleaning the library, Grace was caught off guard by Oliver. He entered quietly, but she saw him reflected in the window. "You know, I've never understood why my mother cares so much about appearances," he said, leaning against the desk with a hesitant smile. "To me, actions speak louder than words." Grace continued cleaning, avoiding eye contact. "Not everyone sees it that way, Oliver." He fell silent for a moment, then stepped closer. "You know my name." She froze. She had made a mistake. Before she could correct it, he pressed on. "I'm pretty sure we've met before. I don't know where, but there's something about you." Grace placed the cloth on the desk, finally turning to face him. She needed to buy time. "I think you're imagining things." Oliver smirked slightly, but didn't seem convinced. "Maybe, but something tells me you're not who you say you are." Grace tried to keep her composure, but inside she knew she was running out of time. Oliver was getting closer to uncovering the truth. That night, Grace met with Emily in secret, away from the security cameras and Helen's watchful eyes. She needed to share something before it was too late. "Emily, listen. You have the potential to change your life, and I want to help you." Emily looked at her, confused. "Why do you care so much?" Grace hesitated. She couldn't reveal everything yet, but her voice was filled with emotion. "Because I've been where you are, and I know that sometimes all it takes is someone who believes in you." Emily held her gaze for a moment before nodding slowly. "Thank you." In that moment, Grace made a decision. No matter what happened, she would do everything in her power to ensure Emily had a chance to escape the cycle that trapped her, even if it meant exposing her true identity. From the distance, unnoticed by Grace, Oliver watched from the balcony. His expression was a mixture of curiosity and concern. He knew there was more going on, and he was determined to find out what it was. The morning began with tension at the Walker mansion. Helen was more irritable than usual, and her relentless criticism of Grace and Emily's work seemed loaded with something deeper, as if she sensed something was off. For Grace, maintaining her disguise was becoming increasingly difficult, especially with Oliver now hovering around her with questions that bordered on discovery. Grace knew he was suspicious. His questions seemed innocent, but she could see the curiosity growing in his eyes, a desire to connect the dots that still didn't make sense to him. In the kitchen, Emily tried to keep the mood light as she prepared lunch for the family. "Helen is even more Helen today," Emily said with a forced smile while chopping vegetables. "I think she caught a whiff of our resistance." Grace smiled faintly, but inside she was worried. Emily was beginning to speak more freely, expressing frustrations she once held back, and Grace feared this could get her into trouble. Mid-conversation, Helen entered abruptly, her eyes going straight to Emily. "These plates aren't clean enough. Do you expect me to serve my guests with this?" she snapped, holding up a plate that looked perfectly clean. Exhausted from the unfair criticism, Emily took a deep breath before responding, her voice tinged with frustration. "Sorry, Mrs. Walker. I'll wash them again." Helen narrowed her eyes. "I hope so. And do it quickly. I have no patience for incompetence." As soon as Helen left, Grace saw tears begin to form in Emily's eyes, though she quickly wiped them away. "It's nothing. I'm used to it," Emily said, returning to her work. Grace felt a wave of anger wash over her. Helen had no idea how much she was crushing this young woman's potential. For Grace, it was just another reason to stay committed to her plan. That afternoon, Oliver found Grace in the garden, where she was trimming some plants. He stopped a short distance away, watching her before speaking. "You're good with your hands," he said, his voice carrying a hint of curiosity. Grace glanced at him briefly before returning to her work. "Thank you, sir." Oliver stepped closer, crossing his arms. "I've already asked you to call me Oliver, but you know, I've been thinking, you really do seem familiar." She stayed focused on the plants, trying to remain calm. "Maybe I just have a common face." "No, that's not it," he insisted, tilting his head. "It's more than that. Something about you." Before he could continue, Helen appeared on the veranda, calling out to him. "Oliver, come, dear. I want your opinion on something." Oliver hesitated, but eventually walked away, casting one last look at Grace before leaving. She exhaled in relief, but knew he was getting closer to uncovering the truth. Later, while setting up the dining room for a formal dinner, Grace overheard a conversation between Helen and one of her guests. They were seated on the couch, laughing about something. "The new maid is so diligent, but she lacks refinement, don't you think?" the guest commented, glancing in Grace's direction. Helen chuckled lightly. "Oh yes, she tries, but some people just have their limits. There's no point expecting more than they can offer." Grace felt her blood boil but remained silent. Conversations like this only reinforced what she already knew. The Walkers, or at least Helen, saw the people around them as tools, not as individuals with intrinsic value. As Emily and Grace finished cleaning the kitchen after dinner, Emily finally broke the silence. "I don't know how you do it. I see the way she treats you. She doesn't even try to be polite," Emily said, loading dishes into the dishwasher. Grace sighed, leaning against the counter. "Because I know this is temporary." Emily looked at her, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Before Grace could answer, the kitchen door opened and Oliver walked in. He looked relaxed, but his eyes quickly locked onto Grace's, his expression more serious than before. "I need to talk to you," he said, ignoring Emily, who glanced curiously at Grace before hurrying out of the room. Grace tried to appear indifferent. "Of course." Oliver closed the door behind him and stepped closer. "I have to ask, who are you really?" Grace felt her heart stop. She tried to maintain her composure, but she knew he was about to piece everything together. "I'm exactly who you think I am," she replied, her voice steady. Oliver didn't back down. "No, you're not. I know there's something more. I don't know what you're doing here, but I'll find out." He left before she could respond, leaving Grace alone in the kitchen with the weight of his suspicions hanging over her. That night, Grace barely slept. With every step she took to maintain her disguise, she felt closer to being exposed. Oliver was on the verge of uncovering the truth, and Helen's hostility only seemed to be growing. But amidst the chaos, Grace thought of Emily, of her mother's story, of the cycle of abuse and disregard that needed to be broken. And as she stared at the ceiling of the small room where she slept, she made herself a promise. She wouldn't leave this house without making a difference, even if it meant risking everything. The morning started quieter than usual. At the Walker mansion, there was a palpable tension in the air, as if something invisible was about to unfold. Grace, trying to keep herself busy, focused on cleaning the living room, even as her mind wrestled with Oliver's words from the night before. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to start asking questions. Grace wasn't sure if she was ready to handle it, but one thing was certain. The truth was inevitable. Later, while Emily was in the kitchen preparing lunch, Grace decided to share what she had found in Richard's files. She needed Emily's full trust before everything fell apart. "Emily, I need to tell you something," Grace began, sitting down beside the young woman. "I found information about your mother in Richard's office files." Emily stopped stirring the pot, turning to face her slowly. About my mum. What did you find? Grace hesitated but delivered the truth. Her termination was labeled as disrespectful behavior, but I'm sure it was something else. Helen probably found any excuse to get rid of her. Emily pressed her lips together, processing the information. I knew it. My mum always said she didn't do anything wrong, but she never gave me the details. Grace took her hand. Your mum was wronged, and it affected your family for years. You deserve better, Emily. Your mum deserved better. Emily's eyes glistened with a mix of anger and determination. But what can we do? They have all the power, and we... Grace interrupted. Don't underestimate what we can do together. Emily looked like she was about to respond, when Helen abruptly entered the kitchen, her gaze darting straight to them, filled with suspicion. I hope you're not wasting time gossiping, Helen said, her voice dripping with disdain. The garden needs watering and the dining room is still a mess. Grace swallowed her anger and nodded, pulling Emily out of the kitchen before the young woman could say something that might get them into more trouble. That afternoon, while watering the garden, Grace once again felt Oliver's presence. He seemed to appear out of nowhere lately, like a hunter sensing his prey. Can we talk? He asked, his voice less confrontational than it had been the night before. Grace set down the watering can and turned to face him. There was no point in avoiding it any longer. All right, speak. Oliver took a deep breath as if searching for the right words. I know you're here for a reason. I know you're not just a housekeeper. It doesn't add up. The way you carry yourself, the way you act. There's something you're hiding. Grace studied him for a long moment before deciding. He deserved the truth, or at least part of it. You're right. I'm not who you think I am. Oliver's eyes widened slightly, but he kept his composure. Then who are you? Grace took a deep breath. I'm Grace Taylor. Oliver took a step back, confused. Grace? My Grace? The CEO? She nodded, her expression steady. Yes. What is going on here? Why are you doing this? His voice was filled with disbelief and confusion. Grace decided to be honest. I needed to know the truth, Oliver, about your family, about you. I wanted to see how you treat people without the weight of my title or my money. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. So, you did this to test me? Grace shook her head. It wasn't just about you, it was about me. I needed to know what I was getting into before taking the next step in our relationship. Oliver seemed to struggle to process it all. You should have told me. I would never have let you go through this. Grace gave him a small, sad smile. And that's exactly why I didn't tell you. You wouldn't have let me, and I never would have learned the truth. Oliver was silent for a long time before finally speaking. And what did you discover? Grace met his eyes. That you're different from your parents, but also that you've been complicit with them for far too long. Oliver looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her tone made him stop. He knew she was right. That evening, Grace decided it was time to confront Helen and Richard. She knew it would be a turning point, but she couldn't continue the charade any longer. During dinner, as Helen and Richard chatted enthusiastically about a charity event they were planning, Grace walked into the dining room with Oliver by her side. Silence fell instantly when Helen saw her. What are you doing here? Helen demanded, clearly irritated. Haven't we told the staff to avoid this area during meals? Grace stepped forward, raising her chin. I'm not staff, Helen. Richard frowned. What are you talking about? My name is Grace Taylor. I'm the CEO of Innovatech Solutions and Oliver's girlfriend. Helen's jaw dropped, and Richard removed his glasses, clearly trying to process what was happening. This must be some kind of joke, Helen said, her voice full of incredulity. Grace remained composed. It's not a joke. I came here because I needed to see who you really are beyond the surface. Helen began to protest, but Oliver interrupted her. Mother, enough. She's telling the truth, and I think we need to hear what she has to say. Grace seized the moment. You've treated the people around you like disposable tools, as if they're not worthy of respect. That's not just unfair, it's cruel. Richard, who had been silent until then, finally spoke. You think you can judge us? Come into our home and point fingers? Grace held his gaze. I'm not judging you as people. I'm confronting your actions. If you want to change, that's up to you." The silence that followed was heavy, but Grace knew she had planted a seed. That night, Emily found Grace in the garden. "So you really weren't who I thought you were," Emily said with a small smile. Grace smiled back. "But everything I told you, Emily, was true. I want to help you." Emily looked emotional. "Thank you. I'll never forget this." As the stars sparkled above, Grace felt that a moment of transformation had begun. The disguise was gone, but the impact of her presence in the Walker household was just beginning. The morning after the revelation, the Walker mansion was steeped in a tense and charged atmosphere. Helen seemed to be walking faster than usual, her expressions shifting between confusion and anger. Richard, usually reserved, kept himself locked in his office, while Oliver avoided confronting his parents directly. Only Emily seemed more at ease, as though the weight of the secret she carried had finally been lifted. Grace, however, knew the real battle was still ahead. As they sat for breakfast, Helen finally broke the silence. "So, Grace, or should I say Miss Scott, do you plan on telling us what you were really trying to prove by infiltrating our home?" Her voice dripped with sarcasm, but there was genuine curiosity beneath it. Grace calmly set her coffee cup down. "It wasn't my intention to humiliate anyone, Helen, but you needed a mirror. You needed to see how you treat people outside your circle." Richard, who had entered the room moments earlier, raised an eyebrow. "So you consider yourself that mirror? Someone entitled to judge us?" Grace took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. "It's not about judgment, it's about accountability. You've created an environment where people have no voice, where they're treated as tools. That's hypocrisy, especially coming from a family that preaches ethics and social responsibility." Helen stood abruptly, her eyes blazing with anger. "You don't understand how things work in this world. We've always done our best to protect our reputation and legacy." "At whose expense?" Grace countered, rising to her feet as well. "At the expense of people like Emily? Or her mother, Camilla, who was unfairly dismissed because she dared to question how she was treated?" Emily, who had been listening from the doorway, froze. It was the first time she'd heard her name brought into the conversation. Helen was silent, visibly taken aback by the mention of Camilla. "Camilla was dismissed because she didn't fit the standards of this household," Helen finally said, her tone defensive. "No," Grace corrected, her voice firm. "Camilla was dismissed because she had the courage to challenge an unjust power structure." Richard tried to intervene. "That was in the past. We can't change what happened." "But you can change what's happening now," Grace retorted, meeting his gaze directly. "You can start by recognizing the value of the people who work here, starting with Emily." Emily hesitantly stepped into the room. "I don't want anything special. I just want a chance to leave here and build a better life," she said, her voice steady but emotional. Helen seemed ready to respond, but Oliver stepped in. "Mom, Dad, she's right. We're wrong. I was wrong too, for not seeing it before. I grew up in this environment, but I never questioned how things really worked." The silence that followed was profound. It was as if the walls of the house were echoing truths no one wanted to admit. Later that day, Helen called Emily to the main sitting room for a conversation. Grace and Oliver stayed at a distance, listening quietly as Helen struggled to find words she had never said before. "Emily, I'm sorry," Helen began, her voice hesitant. "I know you and your family have been through a lot, and while I can't change the past, I'd like to do something to help." Emily looked at her incredulous. "Help? How?" Helen took a deep breath. "By offering you the resources you need to pursue your dreams. If you want to study, we can fund your education." Grace felt a wave of relief and emotion wash over her at those words. It was a small step, but a meaningful one. Emily, however, hesitated. "This won't erase what happened to my mother," she said, her voice steady. "But if you really want to change, you can start by treating the people here with the respect they deserve." Helen nodded slowly. It was clear those words had struck her deeply. That evening during dinner, Richard surprised everyone. He addressed Grace directly. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, "and I have to admit, there are truths we prefer to ignore when they challenge our worldview." Grace held his gaze, waiting for what would come next. My company preaches social responsibility, but perhaps I've neglected that here at home. That was a mistake, and I intend to correct it, Richard concluded. Oliver offered a faint smile, relieved to see his parents finally acknowledging their faults. In the days that followed, changes began to take shape at the mansion. Helen made efforts to get involved in volunteer initiatives, including programs to train domestic workers. Richard, meanwhile, initiated reviews of his company's internal policies to ensure more inclusive and ethical practices. But the most remarkable transformation was in Emily. With Grace's support and a scholarship offered by the Walker family, she began planning her entry into business school. For the first time, the future seemed full of possibilities. On Grace's last night at the mansion, she and Oliver walked through the gardens under the starlight. He held her hand tightly. "You've changed everything, you know, not just for my family, but for me." Grace smiled, squeezing his hand. "Maybe the change was overdue." He stopped, turning to face her. "Thank you for showing me what I didn't want to see. I promise I'll make a difference moving forward." Grace knew there was still much work to be done, but she felt that the seed of change had been planted. Now it was up to Oliver and his family to make it flourish. As she looked up at the starry sky, Grace realized that this journey had been worth it, not just for Oliver or the Walkers, but because she had helped someone like Emily see that the impossible could be achieved. And that, to her, was the greatest victory of all. Months had passed since Grace's turbulent revelation at the Walker mansion. While life had returned to a quieter rhythm, the effects of her presence still echoed in every corner of the house. Helen, who once exuded superiority, now showed genuine efforts to change her ways, though traces of her old self occasionally slipped through. Richard, for his part, was deeply invested in his promise to reform his company's policies and frequently attended events to discuss more inclusive practices. But the greatest transformation was in Emily. Thanks to Grace's support and the Walker family's initiative, she was finally realizing her dream. Enrolled in a business administration program, Emily balanced her studies with an internship at Innovatech Solutions, Grace's company. For Emily, the world now felt much larger and full of possibilities. On a sunny day, the Walker mansion was busier than usual. Friends and family gathered in the gardens to celebrate a special event, Grace and Oliver's wedding. For many, it was more than just the union of two people. It symbolized a broader transformation, a relationship that had overcome social barriers and a family that had begun to see the world from a new perspective. Grace was upstairs, making final adjustments to her wedding dress as Emily, now her personal assistant, helped her. "It still feels surreal to be here," Emily said with a smile, adjusting Grace's veil. Grace chuckled softly, looking at her friend in the mirror. "Surreal for you? Imagine for me. A few months ago I was washing dishes in this house." Emily laughed, but her expression turned serious for a moment. "You changed my life, Grace. I'll never forget that." Grace turned and took Emily's hands. "You changed your own life, Emily. I just gave you a little push. Now it's your turn to show the world what you're capable of." Emily smiled, her eyes glistening, and nodded. "I promise I'll make it count." In the gardens, guests were seated in white chairs, arranged under a large canopy adorned with flowers. Helen and Richard sat in the front row side by side. To everyone's surprise, Helen had personally helped organize the event, and her genuine smile showed her real effort to support her son and his bride. Oliver stood beside the officiant, nervously adjusting his tie. When he saw Grace begin to walk down the aisle, his smile lit up, and all his nerves disappeared. Grace walked slowly, radiant in a simple yet elegant dress. She locked eyes with Oliver, feeling that every challenge they had faced had led them to this moment. The vows were deeply emotional. Oliver spoke about how Grace had helped him see the world in ways he never imagined, while she confessed how he had been her anchor, keeping her steady through storms of doubt. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, applause echoed through the gardens, and Oliver pulled Grace into a kiss that brought tears to many eyes, including Helen's, who discreetly dabbed at the corners of her eyes with a handkerchief. At the reception, Grace and Oliver made a point to acknowledge the people who had been instrumental in bringing them to this moment. Emily received special recognition during Grace's speech. Emily is a shining example of how a person's potential far exceeds the circumstances they're born into. Grace said with a smile directed at the young woman, and I am honored to have her by my side as both a colleague and a friend. The guests applauded, and Emily, visibly emotional, raised her glass of champagne in gratitude. Later that night, as the event continued, Helen called Grace aside for a private conversation. They stood at the edge of the garden, where twinkling lights created a magical atmosphere. I wanted to thank you for not giving up on us, Helen said with a surprising honesty that caught Grace off guard. I know I still have a lot to learn, but I want you to know that I'm trying. Grace smiled softly. We're all trying, Helen. The important thing is to never stop learning and changing. Helen nodded, and for the first time Grace felt the moment was genuine, free from masks or pretense. As the night wore on, Oliver and Grace stole a moment for themselves, away from the crowd. They sat on a bench in the garden under the starry sky. It still feels surreal, Oliver said, holding Grace's hand. Everything we went through to get here. Grace smiled. It's been quite a journey, but I wouldn't change a thing. He leaned in to kiss her forehead, his touch filled with affection. So, what's next, Mrs. Walker-Scott? She laughed. Well, we have a company to grow, an impact to make in the world, and maybe someday a family to build. Oliver grinned. That sounds perfect. The celebration stretched late into the night, but for Grace, the real reason to celebrate went beyond the wedding. It was the lasting impact of her actions, the beginning of a transformation that touched not just the Walkers, but also people like Emily and those who would come after her. As she watched the guests dancing under the garden lights, Grace felt a sense of peace and fulfillment. What had started as a search for answers had turned into a movement for change, proving that with courage and determination, even the most entrenched barriers could be broken. And so, the future had never looked brighter.
We'd love to hear if you're excited about this story. If you had a good time watching the video, go ahead and press 1. If that's not the case, just press 0. Your feedback truly motivates me to collect more heartwarming and significant stories. I'm going to turn this one over to you. What do you make of this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, a huge thank you from the bottom of my heart for getting involved in today's stories. Your love, support, and time mean the world to me,